Good evening. This is on the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address is not a propitious time for speech makers. 2 minutes. Thank you for coming this evening. Welcome to the historic Roosevelt House, where Franklin and Eleanor lived before moving to the White House. And also, welcome to the CUNY Institute for Education Policy, founded by David Steiner, the Dean of Hunter College of Education, just over a year ago. The CUNY Institute is dedicated to clear judgment, innovative ideas, and pragmatic solutions to our education challenges. Our goal is to influence educational policy and practice in order to raise the academic, economic, and life prospects of all American students. I am Peter MEYER, Program Director of the Institute, honored to be part of this exciting new endeavor, and where I have the distinct pleasure not only of working on events such as tonight's program, but also directing and contributing to our news briefs and the policy analysis that appear on our website, which I invite you to visit at nycedthinktank.org. And I want to recognize the newest member of our small but talented team, Ashley Rogers-Berner, our new Deputy Director. Ashley has taught at a Jewish preschool, an Episcopal secondary school, and an open university. Most recently, she co-directed the Institute for Advanced Studies and Cultures program on education at the University of Virginia. She is also a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University and holds an honors A.B. from Davidson College and a master's and PhD in modern history from Oxford University. Welcome, Ashley. Now a little housekeeping. Though I grew up in an era of manual typewriters, we are a part of the Twitter generation and urge you to tweet your friends about tonight's event at #NEXTFORNYC. We do not encourage this in the classroom. You can follow us on Twitter at CUNY Ed Policy. We are also live streaming this event, which means that we have a worldwide web audience, and welcome to you. The video will also be archived on our website. Though the CUNY Institute for Education Policy was only officially launched last May, tonight is our 8th public event. We have discussed topics as diverse as the Common Core and the New York City high school admissions process. Guests have included Mark Bauerlein, David Coleman, and Clara Hemphill. And we had Bill de Blasio here in August when he was running a distant third in the polls. And a week later, he was leading. Correlation, causation. And stay tuned. Next month, Joel Klein is visiting to discuss his 8 years as chancellor. So tonight, we have a powerful panel discussion, one of the most important subjects in American education, accountability. Specifically, what next for New York City's school accountability system? And without further ado, I will turn the program over to David Steiner.
Good evening. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Ashley. I will be very brief. I want to welcome SHAEL POLAKOW-SURANSKI to the podium very shortly. If I may invoke just a moment of personal privilege in the very challenging moment of my commissionership that some of you will recall. It remains perhaps the happiest and proudest outcome of that moment that we have our guest with us tonight, and his very senior work for the department can be dated back to that moment. So I take some very modest but real pride in introducing SHAEL to you. He is, of course, the Chief Academic Officer and Senior Deputy Chancellor of the New York City Department of Education. He oversees the department's instructional work. He really is the Chief Academic Officer, and I can think of nobody more qualified, more expert, and more committed, frankly, to the work of improving the educational outcomes of every student among the 1.1 million who are his responsibility and the responsibility of many in this room. than SHAEL. So it is a particular delight and honor to ask him to present the paper, after which I will ask the panelists to join him and me at the dais. SHAEL.
Evening, everyone. It's great to be here and to see so many people. So last January, we started a process that we do every year when we look at changes we want to make to the accountability system. And this time, we looked at it with a sort of eye towards the longer term, because it was the beginning of the last year of the current administration. We knew that there would be a lot of public dialogue over the course of the subsequent year and beyond about what would change and what would stay the same. And so what I want to share with you this evening is the product of that work, and it's an attempt to begin a conversation. So I hope that after we leave here tonight, there'll be many more discussions along these lines as we look at the right balance for how we look at our schools and what we mean when we talk about a strong school. Let me just start with a core premise that's been driving my work and the work of the department. I have a deep belief, and I think that many teachers and educators across the city share this, that young people have a right to the type of education that actually prepares them for a good life where they can get a good job and they don't live in poverty. And we have not yet gotten to the point in this city or in many cities around the country where consistently for each young person coming through our system, that's the case. And so our collective challenge, and one I think that will continue to be the challenge as we look ahead, is how do we look critically at the work that we've done, the work that we're currently doing, and figure out what has to change and what has to be strengthened in order to really deliver on that promise. And if we believe in that vision and we believe in public education as a means to get to that vision, then part of the core that we have to answer is how do we make sure each of our schools is high quality? And we can stand up and say that as a public education system, we're really delivering what the promise of a public education system is meant to deliver, which is real options and real skills for kids. And in order to get to that quality, we have to be able to ask the question of each of our schools, is this school good? And is it good enough? And how do we know? And we need to then be able to act on the answers to those questions. And that's at the heart of the conversation this evening. And when you look at that question, it quickly gets very complicated. When you try and evaluate school quality, you also are not just making a judgment about what's happening in the school, but you are impacting what's going to happen next in that school and how all of the members of that school community feel and interact with each other. And so that basic premise of both wanting to know if a school is good and whether it's good enough, and the knowledge that once you start to ask that question and start to answer that question, you're having a powerful impact on the people in that community, have to be held in tension with each other. So we look at data, and we have all kinds of data. We have data that's quantitative and standardized and seen as objective, and we also have more qualitative data that doesn't always exist for every school, sometimes exists in pockets, sometimes exists in ways that there are disputes about what it means. And as you start to try and look at these different data streams, you get to the rub of this question. And you start to have to confront, well, what is a fair judgment? And how do we actually bring together this different set of information into something that we can use both for managing schools and also for informing the public about the work? So that's at the heart of the conversation tonight. I'm going to start by briefly just recounting the work that we've done so far, and then I quickly want to shift into some of the questions that emerge from this study and what we think are important areas for further exploration for the next administration. So The brief that's on your chairs and that we'll be talking about this evening is both descriptive, kind of talking about the elements of the current accountability system, the progress report and the quality review, and the different resources and supports that flow from it. And it's also descriptive in terms of how we've used it so far, in terms of trying to create a focus in our schools around student outcomes, especially for kids that have fallen behind, especially for kids that have historically been underserved in our schools. And it's been used to target supports and interventions. Some of those have been very controversial and have had a powerful impact on other debates around education, which we can get to in our discussion. And it's intended to share information and allow the public and school communities and parents and educators in schools to have a common language. And before this accountability system, there was data. It was much more sparse. Often what you would see is the number of kids that passed the state exam or the number of kids that met the state requirements for graduation. And that data did not ever compare schools based on who was in the school and their demographics. The data did not measure all the kids who were below that passing mark that might have moved, or all the kids that were above that might have moved. It was quite a narrow snapshot. And so as we consider what we want in the future, it's also worth looking back and thinking about what we had in the past and what's shifted as a result of this work. So looking at the data briefly, you can see this is sort of the summative data for the system in terms of what happens in terms of outcomes for kids after being in the school system. And we saw that the graduation rate hovered pretty consistently at 50% for decades leading up to the beginning of this administration. And since then has begun to increase, even as the state has raised the standard. Most strikingly also, the dropout rate has dropped significantly, moving from 22% down to around 11%. So many more kids are graduating, many more kids are staying in school. The big question that has been provoked around the graduation data is, well, what does it actually mean to get a degree with respect to the first question I asked, your real life chances when you go out of high school into college or into the workforce? And so we also need to ask the question, how many kids are college and career ready? And we've also seen significant progress in this area. It's basically doubled over the past 7 years, and it's still at about a third of our students who, according to the definitions that CUNY and other universities use for entering the regular coursework of a college student, only about a third of our ninth graders 4 years later are ready for that work. So I'm proud of this progress. Thousands more kids are in college today and are college ready than when we began. And I think we should all be sobered by the fact that we have 2/3 of our students that are not yet getting what they need. Now, as we use this data, we've started to think about how do you support and intervene in the lowest performing schools. And I want to share one new piece of data that hasn't been widely shared previously, because I think it's instructive to some of the questions we'll discuss tonight. And that is, when we've looked at the schools that scored really low on the progress reports over the past couple years, we instituted a process of creating targeted action plans where the school support networks met with the school community, met with the principal, identified 2 or 3 key areas to improve the operational and instructional capacity of the school, and focused additional resources from the network team on those areas. And the first year we got this data back and it said 3/4 of the schools had made progress. And I was skeptical of that because it seemed too good. And so I wanted to give it another year to see if it held up. And so this green bars on this chart is the second year of that data. And again, roughly 3/4 of the schools showed improvement. And 40% of the schools showed significant improvement of 2 grades or more. So that's promising, because what it means is in many of our lowest performing schools, there are strategies that are working and are showing gains around student achievement, and the the value of knowing where to focus and knowing which schools need this type of support, I think is really important as we move ahead. So now just talking a little bit about the accountability system itself, I want to just share a few examples of things that we've tried to do over this period to strengthen it. This has not been a fixed thing. It's evolved quite significantly since it was introduced in 2007. And as we've worked with it, we've changed the metrics. We've changed how we measure growth. We've tried to introduce new metrics that are focused on more than just state exams. And it's interesting, when you look at the high school quantitative progress reports, 50% of that grade is roughly based on state exams. At the elementary and middle school, it's been 85%. And so one of the biggest challenges ahead is to think about how do you get a similar balance at elementary and middle school to what we have had in high school. And we've started to look at some ways to do that. And we'll talk more in a second about what those might be. We've also looked at ways to improve the instructional supports. This shouldn't be a sink or swim environment. So we set up, for the first time 2 years ago, a set of common mandates across the system around instructional expectations, where we asked every teacher to engage in a set of work across the system to improve the quality and the rigor of the curriculum and to change their teaching practice. And as that work deepened, we asked not just, for the initial year, the focus was on one of the units that teachers were teaching. And as we've gone through now into our third year of this work, we've broadened it first to 2 units a year, and now to the full curriculum. And that process of slowly shifting the instructional focus back onto the curriculum and the teaching has been hard fought and something that schools have put intense energy into. And there's a lot of talk around whether the Common Core is a good thing or a bad thing, and a healthy debate. But I think if you look at what's happening in New York City's classrooms as a result of teachers struggling with this question of rigor, that's a product of this work that we started 3 years ago. And it's actually producing really interesting things for kids in classrooms across the city. So now let me turn to the key issues that we've identified that are going to be critical for future work. And I want to frame this with some modesty. We don't have answers here. We haven't figured it out, and we don't know exactly which way it should go, and don't presume to advise the next administration on what they should do. But we do know where we've struggled, and we do know where the challenges that we've encountered are. And I think as this dialogue develops, it's important to understand those constraints and those struggles in order to make good decisions. So the first one is around balanced measures. I talked briefly about this before. The tension between state exams and other types of qualitative measures is real. If you have weak exams and they send a signal to teachers that all you need to focus on is the basic skills, then what you get is a narrowed curriculum. And in the weakest classrooms and the weakest schools, you get a focus on drilling to get to achievements just on those exams, which actually ignores the broader needs of students and often leads to a situation where kids are disengaged and aren't actually learning the things that they need. So how do you get good instructional decisions to flow when state exams are a real part of the landscape of our schools and part of the data that we have available to us to look at school quality? So one of the issues is getting a good balance of other measures. So teachers, for example, give grades to their students on a quarterly basis, sometimes more often, as part of their report cards. There's a lot of research that shows that the correlation between those grades and long-term student outcomes is very powerful. In the high schools since 2007, we've been using that data. we hadn't captured it at the elementary and middle schools until recently. So just a couple years ago, we began to capture it at the middle school level and brought it into the progress report. And we're now in a position to begin to capture it at the elementary school level and bring it in there. Another kind of qualitative measure is the quality reviews that happen annually in our schools, where a senior instructional leader goes into classrooms, looks at what's happening, talks to teachers, talks to kids, and writes a report. It's not nearly as dramatic as a letter grade, but those reports have deep information about what the culture of the school is like, what kinds of supports are available for teachers, what the rigor is across classrooms. And that data can also be quantified and incorporated potentially. And then, in addition to that, there's student work that's happening day to day in classrooms. And this is one of the harder things to use, but we started a pilot last year where we worked with elementary schools to look at authentic examples of student work that weren't from standardized exams that could be tracked and looked at over time to see what the progress is. And that also opens up a possibility for some additional balance. You know, the key to this is not to sort of use one measure and put everything in that basket. And I think that it's one of the weaknesses of what we have now. It's one of the strengths that we have the potential to build on in the high school report. And it's started to shift in the middle school report now. Another area that we began to look at is what is the actual experience of elementary kids when they get to middle school? How do they do? What happens to middle school students when they get to high school? How do they do? What happens to high school students when they go into college? Those kinds of data give you real information about outcomes that go beyond what's happening in any given school year and are worth looking at. The quality of the assessments is critical. The state took a good step in that direction with the assessments that they put out last year. There's a lot of folks who have criticized those as not good enough, and I think there's almost a knee-jerk reaction at this point to criticize any assessments, but I actually think if you look closely at these assessments, they do attempt to measure critical thinking. They do attempt to measure writing in a different way. They do attempt to measure the kinds of reading that kids are doing. And they're also a first step. They're nowhere near the kinds of assessments we ultimately need. And I think we have to keep pushing on this, because as long as there's a federal law that says that kids need to be assessed every year, and that's part of the fabric of our schools, the quality of those assessments is really important, and it's something that we have to push to try and ensure that they start to send the right instructional signal to students. And when teachers are caught between the choice of doing deeper and more authentic forms of learning versus actually preparing their kids to meet the state standards, that's an unacceptable choice to put a teacher into that position. And it should be possible, it has to be possible for states across the country to develop assessments that send an instructional signal that teachers would believe, yes, this is actually the work I need to be doing with my kids and want to be doing. And I think that the work of the National Assessment Consortiums, PARC and Smarter Balanced, is an effort in that direction. There's been real resources put behind those efforts, whereas states have always spent very little money on these assessments. And I think the initial stuff coming out of those consortia actually suggests that it's possible to do a much better job on the assessment front. The third area is room for innovation. So one of the things we hear a lot when we ask for feedback from folks in schools is that the progress report limits innovation because folks are afraid to make a change because it might lead to a dip in their performance, and then they'll be held accountable for that. And so thinking about ways to actually create opportunities for innovation as part of the accountability system is really important. Part of that is creating some flexibility to tailor school-level metrics so that it actually responds to what the school is working on. We have a pilot that we launched this year with roughly 50 schools where networks are actually looking at ways to customize the progress report so that it reflects more accurately the things that they believe their school brings to the table. That's complicated because in order to do that in a way that's fair, you have to figure out what do you hold constant and where do you allow room for innovation and how much innovation. Also the question of time. So one of the criticisms that's been raised over the years is we look at a yearly snapshot of schools as opposed to looking at the trajectory of a school over several years. And we've actually incorporated some changes in the past couple of years to address that exact issue. So for example, in middle schools now we have a metric that looks at kids over the 3 years of middle school that's more similar to the graduation metric in high schools. But that's another area where with a framework that involves looking at the performance over time, you create some room for experimentation and innovation. The quality review I mentioned earlier, I think that if you really want to push on the more qualitative measures in the system, one of the biggest constraints that currently exists is how often do we get into schools to do these quality reviews, who's doing them, and how good are the judgments that they're making. Because inevitably when you move to a more qualitative approach, the question of inter-rater reliability or the subjectivity of the reviewers becomes a central question. So right now a school who's on a sort of generally positive path in terms of the work that they're doing will only have a quality review every 4 years. I think it would be smart to look at ways to increase that, which would take resources. Also, typically our reviews are one reviewer going into the school. Looking at ways to have multiple reviewers as part of that process so you can balance different viewpoints and create checks and balances would also be powerful. And then if you think about what flows from this progress report and the quality review and these different accountability tools, there needs to be more work done to actually connect in a systematic way the right supports to what's emerging from the data. And so I think that networks have done really interesting work in the targeted action plans that I've mentioned. We also have started an initiative called the Middle School Quality Initiative, where we have 90 schools that have volunteered to engage in a much more directive and structured set of research-based interventions around literacy that are showing some promise. But using this data, both the quantitative and the qualitative together, in order to create the right sets of interventions at the right moment in time is one of the things we've now started to see some real benefits from, and there's a lot more work to be done in this area. And then finally, the accessibility of this data. I think it's common to hear that some of the grades are counterintuitive. When you compare schools to each other, using a peer index where you look at schools that have the similar students, you often find schools that are doing very well in absolute terms that are not doing so well when you're comparing them to other schools that have equally strong students. And so it can be counterintuitive, and it may not give the information that, say, a parent is looking for when they're trying to find a school. At the same time, if you don't do that, you're creating an unfair situation where schools that are intentionally serving high-needs kids are being compared on the same measures to schools that are intentionally screening for academic ability. And so you need some kind of balance between those two, and part of the solution, I think, to that is figuring out a way to represent this data in different forms for different audiences, where you actually create tools for parents that are different to the tools that you create for folks who are supporting and managing the schools. There's also ways to make the data more accessible. We started to experiment this year with technology tools, mobile apps, where you can get a lot of information at your fingertips in your phone that is distilled in a way that's very accessible. Because I think if the information isn't usable and accessible, people don't use it. And so challenging ourselves to really get better at how we communicate the information and make it the information that people are looking for is an important piece of this work. And then finally, when we now display our data about schools, the thing that's the headline is the progress report, because it's the thing that has the grade. But the quality review has tremendous richness in terms of the information that's there. So what is a process that we can bring the quality review more to the fore and use that data in an integrated way with the progress report? So I'm going to stop there. That I just said a lot, and I think that now let's open it up so we can have some conversation.
So thank you, SHAEL. Thank you very much. I want to very briefly introduce the panelists. On my far right, Mike Petrilli, who, although listed in your program as Vice President correctly of the Fordham Institute, has also been announced as its next president. So we congratulate you on that appointment.
Thank you.
Mike's a very, very experienced, I would say, commentator on education policy across the country. We're delighted to have the Fordham Foundation. As part of tonight's proceeding, I do want to emphasize that that joint effort has no financial aspects. We are proudly independent at the CUNY Institute and are very, very firmly non-aligned and therefore resist any imputation to the contrary. The next speaker will be Jim LIEBMAN, who is sitting on my far left, professor of law at Columbia, but he is not entirely innocent of the proceedings this evening, since he has had some role in the work that has just been presented. He was the Chief Accountability Officer for New York City, as your program indicates, and is therefore hardly a disinterested observer. On my immediate left, Warren Simmons is the Executive Director of the Annenberg Institute for School Reform. His initiatives around accountability span the country and include Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, and Rhode Island. So he brings to us a perspective that goes well beyond this city. We will be frank, we will be straightforward. I hope we'll be outspoken when the need comes. Let me begin by asking Mike for your reactions to what you've heard, and perhaps putting this also in something of a national context.
All right, great. Thank you very much, David, and thank you for letting us be a part of this. I don't know if I agree that you said that I'm on your far right. I don't know if that's quite fair, but you will decide that afterwards. It is great to be here in New York. I live in Washington, D.C. I should say we are not affiliated with Fordham University. They always want us to say that, particularly when we're in New York, since we tend to be somewhat controversial. I had fun kind of noticing the reception and the event, the differences between D.C. and New York. There's always, a bit of a rivalry. The Atlantic yesterday, I think, had a thing about New York snobs versus D.C. snobs and the way that our snobbery is different. I noticed that in D.C. we would never have a reception before the event. Nobody would actually show up because we'd have to talk to each other, and that doesn't, instead of just email each other and tweet each other. So it was very impressive to see. I see in New York you actually do, it seemed to enjoy having a drink and talking to one another. Differences from D.C. Okay, I'm trying here, people. Come on, help me out. All right. Well, first of all, I'm very glad to be here and glad that SHAEL asked me to be a part of this. And I think that was in part because he noticed that we were writing some things at Fordham, expressing a view that we needed to have a broader way to approach school accountability than many states or cities had been doing. And lo and behold, it lines up quite a bit with what SHAEL and his colleagues have been doing in New York City. When you see the kind of nuance and thoughtfulness that's gone into these efforts in New York to try to collect all this information, qualitative and quantitative, and present it in a way that is helpful to educators to improve what they're doing, as well as to signal to parents, what they need to know about making good choices and knowing how their schools are doing. I think it's fair to say that it is light years ahead of what we see in most places. I mean, first of all, most school districts do not have their own accountability systems, right? Now, that's partly because of scale. You don't have the huge scale that you have in New York City. So what you see mostly are state accountability systems, and overwhelmingly, they rely on one thing, test scores. And that's it, right? And when you see what's happening here in New York, you say, wow, I mean, that feels like the dark ages, that we would judge a school based just on test scores alone. And in many essences, it's not even looking at value added in a very sophisticated way or taking demographics into account. You still have places that have these A to F rating systems that mostly still rely on just how many kids are passing the state test. Okay, so in this debate in New York City, you've got to understand that what you've got here is a system that really is much further ahead. Now, the debates that we're having in education today, so polarized and so much vitriol on both ends of the extreme, I've come to believe that it really is going to make Buddhists out of all of us. And what I mean is, we are all going to cut to the point where we say, you know what, we want the middle way, right? We do not want the extreme to say that we should only have school grades that are about test scores and nothing else, right? And take dramatic actions on school based on test scores alone. At the same time, it seems crazy to go back to an era when we did not collect this kind of information about schools, or take action if we saw that there were some schools that were simply not getting the results that they needed to for our children, right? That year after year, we're not moving the needle at all. So the question is, how do we find that middle way, that middle ground, where we use good information, we make smart judgments, we try to take it all together and come out with something that is actionable and that is fair, and that educators feel like they can take advantage of. I think what SHAEL, a couple of things that SHAEL said were particularly interesting. Number one, this notion that we have to keep in mind the end result. The end result is we want students to be successful in the next stage of their educational careers and the next stage of their life, right? And so especially when we're thinking about at the end of the K-12 experience, we want kids to either go on to college and succeed there, or we want them to go into the workforce and succeed there. We also want all kids to succeed as citizens, right, and to be self-sufficient. And those of us in education reform, we need to admit that a lot of our policies are based on a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is we think if we give kids these certain knowledge and skills, that it will arm them to be successful as they go forward. Now, it's a hypothesis because we can't prove, nobody can say that we know exactly what it's going to take for a young person to go on and be successful in the next stage of their life, particularly if that young person is coming from poverty, right? How do we inoculate somebody who's growing up in poverty so that they are less likely to fall into the various poverty traps that are going to lead to intergenerational poverty? We have a hypothesis, academic knowledge, academic skills. More and more we talk about non-cognitive skills, these things that matter, right? If a school comes forward, though, particularly in high school, and says, look, we think that this mix of skills is more important than that mix of skills, and we can demonstrate that our students over the long term are getting success, then we need to have a system, I think, that allows them to demonstrate and test out that hypothesis. And it may be that some students do less well on test scores, but better on other attributes. The point is, how are they doing in the long term? One last point, and we'll get in this in a little more in detail. This question about elementary schools. Still focus so much on the test scores. Particularly in English, I think there's a lot of reasons to be worried that in English and in reading, the focus on improving year-to-year test scores is going to push schools to a kind of instruction that is not what they need. If you believe that E.D. Hirsch might be right, that what our young people need, especially those growing up in poverty, they need to build their vocabulary, to build their content knowledge. That is something that takes time, that is cumulative. We want to see elementary schools bring back history and science and art and music. This focus on year-to-year reading skills gains might actually be counterproductive. So how can we look at elementary schools that make that long-term investment in slowly but surely building up kids' content knowledge and vocabulary that will have payoff down the road? How can we make sure that we're measuring that as well?
Great. Thank you so much. Warren, why don't we turn to you?
Let me open by making some full disclosure statements. Grew up in East Harlem. I was a graduate of a long-time failing high school, Brandeis High School. Right? So you have to think about the span accountability systems that have failed in New York City, and not only failed schools, but students, families, and communities. Right? I was Director of Equity Initiatives for the New Standards Project, so I thought about this issue across 17 states and 6 urban districts. As a member of the Title I Assessment Committee, we unsuccessfully produced a report and made several recommendations that we thought would lead to more curriculum-embedded assessments and No Child Left Behind, and obviously those recommendations weren't taken up. Urge you to look at the recommendations of the Gordon Commission, School Transformation Work Group here in New York City. I want to make a point here that these issues that we are grappling with are not new. They're like 20 or 30 years old. So to sort of say we're starting to think about this is actually not an accurate statement. And I'd say why we haven't made more continuous progress in addressing these issues is a question we should put on the table, right? Because we've been asking these questions since the New Standards Project, 1993 or 4, since the cross-city campaign's piece on rethinking accountability, which was even before that. Why are we where we are? I'm going to offer you some answers to that question. One is that we are conflating, when we talk about accountability, several purposes for the measures and systems we're trying to develop. One purpose is the evaluative purpose of accountability. School doing well or poorly. Another purpose is what's the information we need if a school is doing well or poorly to help it do better. That's the sort of improvement purpose of any kind of system of information we provide that we often just call accountability, right? Third purpose is what kind of information do we need to justify an intervention? To say a school should be closed, it's moving along the wrong path, right? So I think as we think about accountability, we probably need to think about a new term that captures that we want a system of measures and assessments and processes that address these 3 important functions: the evaluation function, the improvement or diagnosis function, and the intervention function, right? Rather than rely on one system primarily, or maybe even 2 that are not tied together to do all those things. Another issue I'd raise is we say school accountability. It's my belief, and some evidence bears this out, that success and failure in schools is co-constructed. School plays an important role in the success or failure. Partners play an important role in the success or failure, whether they're networks or charter management organizations. The central office, given the policies about student assignment and teacher selection and assignment, play an important role in success and failure. And the way the broader community distributes its resources to schools. I went to PS 121 in East Harlem, 121st Street. Good set of teachers in that school. I got bused for school integration purposes to PS 183. Good set of teachers in that school. The major difference between 183 and 121 were the resources that were surrounding 183. Rockefeller University, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, fully equipped libraries, right? A whole host of things around PS 183 that contributed to the success of those teachers and principals that weren't as available in East Harlem, and yet the success and failure of both schools was attributed almost exclusively to the schools. So as we think about accountability and measures, what measures data are we collecting to inform the school's role in the success or failure, network and partners' role? So the notion of reciprocal accountability. Right now, many of our accountability systems point from the top down, right? As opposed to looking laterally and up and down at the co-construction of success and failure. How am I doing for time? I'm talking very fast. One more. I got like 15 more. But the last big idea that will influence how we respond to the questions. I think we're moving in the right direction in this report. But the interpretation and implementation will be based on the values that are driving the theory of change for the new leaders of the system. I think the existing values, and some of them appear repeatedly in the report, are autonomy, and innovation, and performance management. Those are interesting values, right? I'd say even important values, right? And if you use those values to guide the kind of system that you are developing, you would underplay the role of central office and overplay the role of schools, because you say autonomy is central, right? You would emphasize data, mostly objective data, because of performance management, right? And the notion of community contributions and central office supports and reciprocal accountability would be underplayed, right? Now you can have another set of values driving your development of an accountability system. Equity, it's not only the school's responsibility, but the system and community's responsibility to make sure schools get the supports they need. And how do we collect data to determine whether that's happening? Excellence, we need a broader definition of what that entails, that includes academic achievement and tenacity and other social-emotional supports. And communities of practice, right? That teachers aren't producing success and performance alone, they're doing it with each other, with principals, with supports. And so if those were the other or additional values, or even the driving values, you would actually wind up with a different kind of accountability system and a different relationship between the department, the schools, the networks, and the community than you would with an accountability system driven by the values of autonomy, performance management, and the other thing I mentioned, which I'm not going to say because it takes too much time right now. That's my opening foray. I will stop there.
Thank you, Warren. And Jim, I would encourage you to respond both to the presentation, but also perhaps to some of the things Warren has said.
Well, thank you all for being here and for allowing me to give some thought to these really interesting ideas that SHAEL has proposed. I agree with him that all things considered, New York City's school children have made more academic progress than those in any other city in the United States. That's a strong statement, but there's no other possible competitor when you think of the outcomes that SHAEL talked about. But there are no laurels to rest on here, none at all. The city kids remain way, way behind where they need to be. And so the real question is, what do we do next? And I think the important point here is that what's happened up to this point that has allowed those accomplishments to occur are a springboard for more improvement, and that's really, I think, the most important thing. Now, I would attribute the gains that have occurred to three principles, the springboard that's there. One is a deep sense of responsibility to accelerate the learning of all children. The second is brutal honesty about every instance where the central system, a school or a classroom, has failed to boost a child's learning. And thirdly, and Warren mentioned this, empowerment and enabling tools for educators to enable them to move kids forward, to move all kids forward. Now, the accountability system is crucial. It's not by any means the only thing, but it's crucial because it is a powerful motivator of educators to take responsibility for accelerating every child's learning, and it does help to assure honesty about where the system or a school or a classroom is failing particular kids, even if it's good with most kids. All of the world's fastest improving systems, whether you're thinking about Singapore, Helsinki, Toronto, and now it turns out that Washington, D.C. in the United States has been shown to be making a lot of progress. All of them blend steps to motivate a sense of responsibility for all children and transparency about and a commitment to learn from failure wherever it occurs with empowerment and support. The proportions differ, but all of them have all of those pieces. And if you leave out the yeast, that is, you leave out the motivation to help all kids learn, and you leave out the transparency into where that's not happening, learning results will not rise. So that's important. Now, under SHAEL's leadership, the accountability recipe here has sharply improved, as he described, and he proposes more changes, which I think, at least for my interpretation, it might not be SHAEL's, is that the balance is being restruck a little bit away from performance management, a little bit more towards empowerment and support. And I think that's a good idea. 5 years ago, that would not be true. When I was working in the district, I would go to meetings with principals all over the city and teachers, and they would say publicly within their group that they were not responsible for all kids in their classrooms in their schools because poverty was responsible. Parents were responsible. They didn't have to take responsibility. They weren't motivated to take that responsibility. Well, this system, as SHAEL has pointed out, has changed that. And now that there is this system-wide sense of responsibility, I think it's time and useful to think about changing some of the focus to supports and empowerment and toning down a little bit on the performance management. So what I thought I'd do here to end with is just to give you sort of my recipe for the mix. This is actually a number of things that SHAEL mentioned, but a couple or few that maybe he won't like so much. First is to continue prioritizing student learning growth, which is what we care about. We want to see kids move every year, and it isn't tied to family wealth. And to prioritize that over current learning status, which is almost entirely a function of wealth. If you go back to just focusing on status, what you tell teachers is, you want your kids to improve? Get better kids, or move to a school where there are only rich kids, because there they'll do better automatically. But using the old standards, kids' poverty is destiny. Secondly, we need to get rid of, I think, the zero-sum rules that pit schools against each other by pegging school grades to how each does compared to others. That deters collaboration. Instead, give schools realistic targets based, as SHAEL suggested, on recent outcomes by the best schools like them, and give the top schools the top ratings. That is, if you meet the mark, you all get the same ratings, and it's fine if everybody gets it because you've all done well. I would also agree that we should base the overall rating on the leading indicators in the quality review as well as the lagging indicators in the progress report. So I would put those together. That's a mistake I made when we didn't do that. I'd continue adding, as SHAEL is doing, more diverse measures of student work, and also to let innovating schools add their own metrics if they show that they're no less rigorous. This is something that was suggested earlier by Mike, and I think that's a good idea. I don't think we should ease up on schools' responsibility to evaluate teachers and to embrace the Common Core, but I would suggest giving schools a little bit more flexibility about how to use those tools. I think some of that flexibility needs to come from the state, particularly on teacher evaluation. Don't restore geography-based deployment of school supervisors. Special interests love that old system because it gave them power over patronage in schools, but it's a disaster for poor children. Continue letting schools opt into networks of schools that are like and face similar challenges. Finally, something SHAEL started to talk about at the end, give parents more of a role in decision-making. Not through special interest politics the way it was done in the past, but through real participation in problem solving and innovation. For example, let parents design those new reports that SHAEL says we need that are understandable to them to show what the progress report says.
Thank you.
Stop that, man.
I've just stopped him. I apologize.
Okay.
Let me ask for one set of reactions to what's clearly, in some ways, an elephant in the room. The incoming mayor has, as most of you know, indicated that he, at least at this point, is inclined to let go of the letter grades. And he is also presumably responding to perhaps the fundamental paradox of education reform in New York City. Most folks are aware of the successes. And you can fight data all day long, but I've yet to see one reputable study that doesn't say that New York City's school children are better off now than they were at the beginning of this administration. At the same time, those reforms have failed at this point to register the support of a majority of the parents of New York City. That is a fundamental paradox to which the next mayor must respond. And the letter grades, the accountability systems are right in the middle of that paradox. They are, according to the Chief Academic Officer, a key component of having produced the academic gains. At the same time, they are clearly a part of what has turned parents off the system. So my question, and maybe it goes to a combination of the different values that Warren put on the table and the crucial elements that SHAEL was referring to. I don't have the recipe, but I want the panel to respond, because this is not only true of New York City, it's a national issue, to how do we take what we believe has worked and change the value systems, change the communication, change something, so that we are not constantly seen as an apparatchik group of reformers, top down, losing our parents, a fact that has been highlighted, unfortunately, only too much in the last few days. Mike, do you want to say something?
I feel like somebody's going to say something about white suburban mothers, but this being a big city, I guess we can avoid that comment, so that's good. First of all, I hope that the new mayor comes in and takes a close look at what has been done here in this system and sees that it is much more than letter grades, right? I mean, behind these letter grades is a lot of information, a lot of nuance, and a lot of thoughtfulness about how to make judgments about schools. And so, again, that is very different. You go most places in the country, and there isn't much behind letter grades, right? It's just some test scores and an algorithm, and there's a lot more here. So look, there's a difference between campaigning and governing, and perhaps the mayor will decide that there's a lot here that's worth keeping. You know, if he decides that he's going to keep everything but the letter grades, and it's going to, you know, they'll come up with some other descriptors, you know, some schools are
Blue ribbon.
needed improvement, right, blue ribbon, super duper, special. I think that's okay. I mean, what the press will do is they will just equate those new ratings with the letter grades, right, and that'll be okay. On the bigger question about how to get the public and the parents bought into these reforms, look, I think that it is I think that we have to be honest with people that there are trade-offs in any of these reforms, and that how to say this rightly in the midst of the Obamacare debate and everything else, that there are winners and losers, right? That if you have a system that is saying, you know what, we're going to focus on testing, and the testing is going to help our lowest performing kids do better, you know, but let's be honest that it might, in some ways, not be great for the higher achieving kids, right? It might actually lead to instruction in their schools that is worse than they would otherwise have. Can we either be honest about that and say, look, if this is a tale of two cities, if this is an issue of equity, but, you know, we got to do what's best for the poorest kids, even if maybe the middle class and upper income kids don't benefit from it, let's have that conversation. If that's not what we want, then we need to have a strategy that protects schools serving the higher income kids or protects the higher performing kids from the downside of some of these reforms. So I think it's that balance that we haven't been able to strike. And I think part of it starts with being honest with ourselves. You know, there are trade-offs. If you want to focus on raising the performance of kids who are furthest behind, some of those strategies might end up, you know, either neglecting or not helping the kids at the middle or at the top. Is that something that New York, you know, but there's an equity argument for doing that or not. So I think that's where I think some of those conversations need to happen.
Warren?
For me, it's rooted in the values piece again. So if your values are that you are building an accountability system that treats parents and students as clients and customers, and that what it is equipping them to do is to exercise choice, then all you have to do is have an accountability system that labels the school success or failure, and then say, parents, it's up to you to choose, make a better choice, right? That's one set of values. Another set of values is that, you know, parents are actually partners, and they not only want to know the gross performance of a school, they actually want to know what can be done to improve its quality over time so that they can make realistic choices. That kind of accountability system would actually emphasize transparency. It would actually engage parents in identifying measures that might be important to them. It might even have parents and students involved in a quality review process, which we actually did in Philadelphia. Actually, their judgments weren't far off from the judgments of so-called experts, right? That sort of builds ownership for the results and findings rather than doubts and suspicions, but it also builds the hope of a system that's going to be responsive to what's found there, that it isn't simply the job of the parent or the principal or the teacher. that it's the job of this entire community to create a system of successful schools, no matter what neighborhood you live in, no matter what income level you have, as opposed to what may now be seen as it's a responsibility of the parent to make a more informed and better choice among a limited range of options. And actually, those options get labeled differently every year. You're in A school one year, you're B another, you're 2 years. So the labels that we're giving people and asking them to chase, you just vary tremendously year by year, which undermines confidence in parents, students, and teachers that anybody knows what's going on in the system in an authentic and meaningful way.
Sure. On the great issue, I'm about where Mike is. But I think the point that Warren raises is really the crucial one, which is, I think the biggest mistake that the past administration made, and this is not SHAEL's mistake, it's just, it was that the idea was, and you actually put your finger on it, was that if we give parents better results, better service, 311 sorts of things, and more choice, then they don't need politics. They don't need participation. They don't need to be involved because they'll get what they want as a consumer. And I think that's true for some things, but it turns out that public education is something that parents really deeply, and the public really deeply want to be involved in. Now, why that happened was because the system wanted to get rid of interest group politics, which had destroyed the system. But people perceived this as they lost something, and they did lose interest group politics. And plenty of people in my neighborhood who didn't like it anymore, that they couldn't call somebody up and get their kid into a school that was the best school. But the point is that I think it was right to take away special interest politics. It was wrong not to provide another form of politics or participation, very much like Warren pointed out. And I think that's the point I was trying to make at the end. You need to have a role for parents in schools, in groups of schools, and at the central level that involves them in actually problem-solving some of these issues. And I think that's not an easy thing to do, where it doesn't turn into the parents who show up and the parents who have the resources get, more than other parents. It's really work. It's hard work, but I think it's work that really needs to be done.
I want to give SHAEL a chance to react both to my question and to the reactions.
Yeah, I mean, two things. On the first question, I think the mayor-elect's been clear that he's going to move away from the letter grades. He's also said that he wants to continue to have a progress report and wants to engage in a public dialogue about what should that report look like. And so I think that is a necessary step to build on the work that's been done so far. As I go around the city talking with parents, which I do a lot of, the two things that come out most strongly is a desire to have a real engagement in what's happening in their kids' school, where they're respected and valued and seen as partners. And that involves structuring time into the practice of schools to make those connections real, to build trust, to build space for authentic conversations that go well beyond the sort of summative scores or the kids' letter grades, and get to real conversations about what kids' next steps are. And one of the things we started to do, which is I think a very early and small first step in that direction, in partnership with Coalition for Educational Justice, we've started to have extended parent conferences this year, specifically around kids who are struggling on the state's new exams. And I think it's built on practices that we've seen really succeed in a lot of our schools, where when parents come in, especially if kids are involved in this, you can have a conversation that can really move a kid's trajectory and build a relationship between kids and parents that is different. And having the school sort of be part of that conversation with the family is not something that happens systematically yet, and I think could be a very powerful thing. On the broader point around engaging parents, I think what I also hear is a deep suspicion and concern about what is the impact of all the focus on exams having on the instructional practices in schools. And I think that's part of the purpose of these proposals that we've laid out here, is to begin to send a more balanced signal where schools at the principal and teacher level begin to see a way to prioritize authentic, deep kinds of student work and learning that is rewarded in how their evaluations are being done, so that there isn't the kind of narrowing that has happened in some schools. And that's not an easy thing to do, because it's not just about the accountability system. As Warren said, it's also about the support system. Because to do that well, you have to invest in building teacher capacity, and you have to invest in teaching folks in school communities to teach in a different way and to engage with their kids in a different way.
So I'm very shortly going to go to the audience. One last point, capacity, very quickly. You have relied to some degree on these networks, these school support networks. They are, I don't think it's a secret to say, very, very deeply varied in their capacity to deliver the kind of professional development, the partnerships. Is this, in the long run, a viable model? It is part of the accountability system. What could be done to help to turn that into something that connects parents, teachers, students, and performance in more powerful ways?
So in every iteration of this organization, there's always been a field staff whose job it is to go in and work with educators in schools. And for those of you in the room who've been around the system for a long time, generally the people who do that work are quite widely criticized. And I think that sometimes for good reason, and sometimes because there actually are real systemic constraints to impacting schools from the outside successfully. And so I think we have to be smart about how we do it. You know, when you do it in a way that is too directive, what you get is a compliance response. And people manage up and they say yes, 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 and they close their doors and they do something totally different. There has to be a partnership. And part of the reason for the focus on autonomy at the school level was to try and push responsibility for the decisions, the instructional decisions, closer to the people that have to implement them. And I think the thing that we've begun to experiment with, and I mentioned the Middle School Quality Initiative is a really interesting example of this, is that you can pair that autonomy with some structured support. It doesn't have to be an either or. You can give support where it's needed, when it's needed, without controlling everything. And I think that path is what I would suggest we need to explore moving forward.
Great. So I ask for questions. The usual provisos, please no speeches. I will be asking you to keep your remarks short and a question, and we will please open this up to all the panelists, not just to SHAEL. You had your hand up first. Could you stand up and use the mic?
Yes. Hi. The first thing is, I work with the National School Climate Center, and one of the things that I'm hearing is continuing, but I'm not hearing how it's being addressed, is we're testing and we're assessing. I question whether we're assessing for diagnostic reasons so that we can learn from that, or if we're testing to judge and be punitive. That's one thing. But the other thing is that what we're not talking about actually assessing is social emotional education. And you're talking about how do we connect the administration, how do we connect the students, how do we connect the teachers? We have ways of doing that. And that is one thing that it's used in some schools, very, very few. So that would be my first question. My second question, and a very brief question, is another elephant in the room, which is that yes, the scores have been going up, but another score that has been going up is since 2006, the New York Justice Task Force just released a report this year, 40% increase in the ISS. And the number of times a child is in ISS, in school suspension, in middle school, is the single highest predictor for lifelong incarceration.
Okay.
So I would like to know how that's being addressed, because that's an entire population that seems to be not dealt with in this conversation.
So social and emotional intelligence and the...
So one of the things, if you get to read the paper, we do actually agree that we haven't figured out how to measure, even for formative purposes, well, the kinds of academic and social traits and behaviors that often don't have so much to do with academics, but have to do with what makes human beings successful in academic environments and in work environments. And I think we set out a set of indicators 2 years ago as a guide for schools to begin working on things like persistence and resilience, like learning to work together in teams, like learning how to get help, and learning how to communicate around when things are confusing and hard. And what we need to begin to do is think about, are there ways to gather data on that that can inform what we know about schools?
Yes.
And well, there's a lot of research out there. The challenge that I think I would pose is the minute that you attach stakes to that data, it changes it. And so do we want to attach stakes to it, or are there other ways that we should be considering using it? That's the question that we've been struggling with.
Okay. Go ahead.
I know a number of you, you've known of me for a number of years, some of you, including I'm in Jim's neighborhood, but have not assailed him too often on the street.
No question.
There's, as you know, a 40% rate of struggling readers by 4th grade, according to the NICHD. So from my point of view, you will never see change until that's addressed. My question to this panel is, an enduring source of frustration and suspicion from parents comes from the following issue. If what you really had wanted was to improve all of the schools in New York City, why didn't you, and neither of you were there at the time, neither of you, school board people, DOE people, but the choice was made to waiver 209 schools. Why weren't those schools studied to say, what are they doing right that we can waiver them and leave them out of this big thing that we're about to do for the next 12 years?
So just to give a little context for people who aren't aware of it, at the beginning of Joel Klein's tenure, they instituted a common curriculum in 2003, and there are 200 schools that were given flexibility around the curriculum. I think, I was a principal at the time that happened, and I think that my understanding of the strategy was that where schools were really succeeding with kids, that flexibility was important and necessary. But I think it's a fair question in terms of the deeper question of, how to study what works and replicate it. What I've learned on that point is that it's not good enough to actually document the set of practices that work in a school, write them down, and then tell people in another school, these are the things you need to do to be successful. It doesn't actually end up working. What does work is when someone lives in a school, as part of the fabric of that culture, sees how decisions are made and how resources are allocated, how learning occurs, and then sort of builds that into their own DNA and takes it to another place and is part of building that in another place. And that is a strategy that we've actively been using as part of our leadership development work to try and bring that kind of insight from the stronger schools in the city to schools that are struggling.
Yes, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Martin. I'm on a city council that represents parents of the Department of Education. The parents love data, believe it or not. Grades are not bad, but they don't like how it affects their kid. Many years ago, you actually changed the grading system, and said that for K 3 to 8, there had been about a 35% inflation in grades and scoring. We never heard that in high school. People question high school. People love that they live in an A community school. They love that. As the city has rejuvenated, they love living in those kind of communities. What they hate is that their child is being hurt on test scores. They hear their child's now at 2 because of Common Core, for example. So my question to you is, why can't the city do more in schools where the average peer score is very low, a 1.6, a 1 point, where kids are overwhelmingly struggling, and push those kids into schools that are nearby that are overwhelmingly succeeding as A's and B's? Why can't the state say that instead of test scores that are much lower, 40, 50% lower than they used to be on Common Core, why can't it all be pass-fail until teacher evaluations come through? Otherwise, kids internalize that they used to be a 3 and that they're now a 2. They could help parents feel better about their kids.
So I think that I think what you're tapping into is right, that across the city right now, there's deep concern for a lot of families about what does this new standard mean and how do we make sense of that. And I don't think there's an easy answer, which is part of why we created those extended parent conferences, to have a richer conversation where you talk about more than the number on the test, but actually talk about the strengths and weaknesses of what you're seeing for kids. In terms of the idea of having kids who are in struggling schools go to schools that are doing better, there are opportunities that are limited for those kinds of transfers as part of the NCLB process, but it's a complicated thing to do because in those schools that are doing well, there are limited seats. And so for as many offers as are made, there's not often enough space in those schools to accommodate all of the kids that are interested in that process. There was a third point that you had made.
I was interested to know about a pass-fail option at the state level for Common Core, because so many kids feel they used to be a 3 and they internalize them now 1s and 2s.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't talked to the state about that idea. It's an interesting question.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
Can I just jump out? I have to admit that this is New York City. I'm surprised. It sounds so warm and fuzzy. I think that we'd say, "Come on, kids, suck it up. You got to do better." I mean, this is what when Arnie Duncan made this statement the other day and got all this controversy. I mean, I thought it was a really stupid comment he made, and I thought to myself, there's no parent out there who's really upset that the state is telling them their kid actually needs to do better. I mean, but maybe I'm wrong. I mean, there are actually parents out there that really don't want to hear the bad news. Well, they need to get over it.
No.
Warren, just a second, Warren would like to say something.
Yeah,
Just a second, we'll get to you.
actually, I was going to say this as a positive statement. So the recalibration of the state assessments is actually now giving conflicting information to parents. A year or two ago, their students were successful, or high achieving, and a year later, magically, they're below proficient. Right? That actually has not only an impact on the parent, but the students and the practitioners as well. Right? And so it's not causing people to question. It's causing people to say, how can this result have changed so radically? And it's undermining trust in the system, and anybody knows what they're doing. Right? Now, there's an opportunity here. Right? Here's the opportunity. It's actually, in my judgment, the polarization between successful and less successful schools and charter schools and traditional schools is being lessened by the fact that they're all bad now, or they're not doing as well as they previously thought they were, and it's leading them to ask questions about how do we collaborate and build our capacity and share learning across what were formerly divides of charter, traditional, network. I think that's an opportunity for the support and capacity building question to override the competition and choice question that sort of divides people. The solution simply is find a better option. That now we all collectively need to strengthen our ability to learn, but it's not a call for the reinvention of the old central office. Right?
Very quickly, because
It's a call for, in 50 seconds, for lateral capacity building. School to school, partner to partner, guided and facilitated by central office, but not directed by it. And so I think that's an opportunity to shift the conversation to give a positive response as opposed to what could be a negative response from the community, which is an attack on the validity of assessments overall.
yes,
Countless research.
just a second, Mike is coming.
countless.
Countless research studies have pointed to the teacher, the classroom teacher, as the critical variable for student achievement. But only one study, way back in 1970, Jacob Kunin's discipline group management in classrooms, only one study actually looked in the classroom what exactly is happening with ineffective teachers. What exactly is happening in the classroom, that is. And it's very simple, guys. It is so simple. Our kids, even our brightest, gifted, and talented kids in schools like Hunter College Elementary School, where I did my student teaching, even our brightest kids are being robbed every day by their teachers of instructional time with teachers' favorite subject, classroom management. In other words, the school accountability measure that I propose here is one very, very simple, objective that it just requires a stopwatch. Go into any classroom, gentlemen, any classroom, gifted and talented, low socioeconomic status, choose a grade, and with a stopwatch, you will be astonished how much little time is spent in the teacher leading pre-planned classroom learning activities. In other words, doing their job, how much little time is spent in actual classroom learning activities.
Okay, we get it. So classroom management, the quality of the teacher and the place of that issue in an accountability system.
I've been talking a lot. Why don't I give someone else a chance?
Yes,
Let me just say
Jim.
something about that. First of all, the real thing that makes a difference is how much the students are talking in classrooms about what the issue is. It's not really, but I think, but one of the really big important things that the Common Core is doing, and one of the really big important things that some of the work that SHAEL talked about that's happening in schools around the Common Core, is focused on exactly those sorts of things, which is to get teachers to get beyond the idea that it's just about managing the classroom and to get to a place where they're really engaging students, and that where a lot of the information and the conceptualization that's taking place is coming from the students. I think that's going to be a vast improvement of students, but it's going to take time to come from the Common Core.
Yes, just very quickly, I think the challenge of too many systems right now, right? Accountability systems for teachers, state accountability systems for schools, city accountability systems for schools, Common Core standards, new curriculum, professional development. Part of what may be going on for teachers, frankly, that I've spoken to is overload. We all believe in these reforms when we, that is the policymakers, put them in. But a little bit of modesty about everything we're throwing at teachers and students at once may have to come in if we're not going to lose the reforms. Yes, Peter.
Hi. This afternoon, I reread Federalist 10 when James Madison talked about factions. In LA or Chicago or New York, we see factions fighting louder and louder. The school community seems more and more involved in mortal combat than in actually looking for solutions. And I wonder whether this wonderful panel is more like the band playing on the decks of the Titanic. I mean, how do we, in the next few months, with the new mayor coming in, actually bring together these factions who, for the past few years, have been spending more and more time fighting with each other rather than trying to seek solutions to all these problems?
Well, I mean, I think one of the ways to do it is to use the organizations that exist, that have developed platforms, the 2013 campaign. There are other organizations that have developed platforms. And for this community to come together in the leadership of the new mayor and the department's leadership to do a basic examination of where the system is. I mean, we talk about school quality reviews, we talk about teacher assessment. I think we need a department assessment, and that's not to focus on the leadership of the department, but to look at the system as a whole, look at the kinds of recommendations that have been made by various groups that have been convened over the last 3 years that are out there. There are lots of reports that have been done. I mentioned the School Transformation Work Group, the 2013 campaign. These reports, I think, are very positive and promising. But I think it's up to the leadership of this community to come together to develop a reform direction going forward. I'm surprised at the number of times communities like this, after being warring factions, turn themselves over to a new leader who then develops a strategic plan with a small group of experts that then we critique 2 years down the road, right? I think actually achievement first started out in a very promising way with Joel Klein, that he did convene a process. Many of you were part of it. But as the reforms got underway and as shifts were made, that process was jettisoned and the reform directions were informed by a narrower and increasingly narrower group of people, and lots of organizations and groups are sidelined. So in a city like this with all the universities, organizing groups, union leadership, I see no reason, civic leadership, why we confine ourselves to an individual chancellor and a small group of experts to define the direction for this system. If we can't get that organized and implemented here, I don't know. I can't see Washington, D.C. doing it any better than us.
Nate?
One more question.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on Warren's comment because I think it's a good one. You were talking before about this, what you perceive as this disconnection between what you talk about the great progress of the system with the fact that so many parents and stakeholders feel frustrated and angry and don't see this as a successful process.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first you might want to try to put some of them on your panel, at least one,
Right.
and 5 men and no women. I mean, there are just some things that
Right.
you might want to think about here
Right.
in the future. And also,
Oh.
the other thing, I just want to quickly address something that SHAEL talked about here, which is, I mean, we're not just talking about parent engagement at the school level. We are talking about the fact that we have a panel for education policy that completely disempowers all stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
These are people who, we've all seen thousands of people come to those PEP meetings
Mm-hmm.
to protest against school closings of low-performing schools, perceived as low-performing schools by the DOE. Nothing changes at PEP, right? We see CECs that have no real power. We have CPAC that doesn't have any real
we have a
power.
question?
We're talking about, I'd like you to address the issue of political power when it comes to actual decisions that get made in the system. And I just want to end by saying, Jim, I understand the problems. We all know that school boards had problems. We know that the community school districts had problems. But I think we've lost a lot. Wasn't just about interest group politics. There were school boards that worked well. There were districts that worked well. And I think by taking the local element out of it, we've lost a lot. And I think parents have lost a lot. And people in the grassroots have lost a lot. There's no local entity that's accountable.
So first of all, very quickly, I take a mea culpa here. This is the first event I've ever chaired at this institute that hasn't had a woman on the panel. So it won't happen again. Secondly, we will have one more question to balance the genders. So points well taken. I think the question, however, goes to Jim.
Yeah, I think I actually agree with everything Warren said.
Nobody ever agrees with that.
I don't agree with everything you
Okay,
believe,
good.
but
Right,
only
that's
everything you've
that's
said
sad.
so
Okay,
far.
I like that.
But I just want to be understood here. I believe there needs to be a politics, and that politics needs to be very participatory, and it needs to engage people in actually doing the work, designing reports that are going to be used for parents, problem solving around schools and around those things. What I don't think is a good thing, and I'll stand by this, is to allow a small number of interest groups that really care more about certain kinds of interests. They're perfectly, we want people to listen to me, I listen to you, you'll listen to me. So we want groups to pursue their interests, but they shouldn't control the system. I think parents should control the system, and the parents who want to do the work. And so I would put it in the hands of those folks who want to roll up their sleeves and actually do some of the work. And as SHAEL suggested, I would provide a lot more opportunities for that to happen.
The last question belongs to you.
Okay, I'm a CCH member. I was a CEC. I was also one of the appointees, trustees for Crew when he removed boards. So I've been around for a long time. I think I'm going around for 5 times. My question is, if you want the Board of Education to educate our children, you must work with the parents. How can you say that parents are important and you do not participate? Don't tell me you gave them a conference, you have computers. Not everybody has a computer. Language barriers, poverty. We're not seeing it across the board. There is no equal education across the board in New York City. Absolutely not. The politics is still in the Board of Education because it's still being done. We still have people that are not teaching our children, but then every parent is blamed for it. So if you want this board to do something, figure out how you're going to get the parents back in there.
That seems to be a powerful message for the evening. This is a movement of progress and setbacks, challenges and difficulties. This is a system of 1.1 million school children speaking 180 languages. No other city in the world has tried to do this at this scale. And I hope that the conversation that starts this evening and that this evening builds on previous conversations, of course, will continue with the new administration. These are questions that are not going to go away, and I hope that we can all work together to bring the best insights of the practice of the last decade and not lose them with the things that haven't worked and to address them. And that is going to take a lot of hard work and hopefully more work than